Hello, I'm Dominic Walker, JMW's Inside Man, and I'm with Peter Barnard. Peter is a partner in JMW's commercial litigation team, and Peter specialises in property litigation. Hello, Peter.
Hello, Dominic. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So previously, commercial landlords had thought that it might be quite difficult to collect rent from tenants, with it being this pandemic period, but that's not necessarily the case now.
No, it's not. What we've seen over the last few weeks, Dominic, is various decisions from the court in terms of addressing arguments that had been raised by tenants as to why they shouldn't be paying rent during the pandemic, principally around insurance provisions in leases that they sought to rely on that were in favour of landlords, but also general contractual arguments around frustration and things like that. What those recent cases have established is that those arguments aren't really going to go anywhere. And in circumstances where rent is payable and there's no reason for it not to be payable, the courts will grant summary judgment against tenants to have that rent paid. So effectively the message to tenants is where you can pay rent, you ought to pay it. And if you don't pay it, then you're potentially subject to proceedings being issued by your landlord to recover that rent.
And I know that you advise both landlords and tenants, but practically, what's your general advice?
Yeah, I mean, the general advice has to be that where tenants can afford to pay and can make payment, they ought to make payments, and where they can't, they ought to try and come to some arrangement with their landlord. The position has moved relatively recently in terms of the ability for landlords to forfeit their leases for non-payment of, or tenants' leases for non-payment of rent. There was a moratorium in place until the 30th of June, but in the last week or so, the government's extending that to the 25th of March next year. So there's now going to be a further 9-month window within which landlords can't forfeit their leases for non-payment of rent. That means that their options are slightly limited in terms of what they can and can't do. And whilst they can go off and issue proceedings, as I've already mentioned, and we are getting some results for landlord clients in doing that, in circumstances where tenants can't physically reopen, what the government is saying they're going to do is effectively create a new class of tenants to protect those that can't pay rent because they're forced to close and can't reopen at the moment. And what they're going to be able to do is effectively argue that the rent that they owe should be ring-fenced, and then agreement should be reached with the landlord as to that ring-fenced rent for the period of time where they couldn't open. And if agreements can't be reached, then the government is suggesting that there be a private arbitration process that's brought into effect to then try and force an agreement between landlord and tenant in due course. So what the government's effectively doing is creating different classes of tenants and dividing up and creating a differential between those that can pay and they are open, and those that can't pay because they can't physically open because they're not allowed to.
And when you mention different classes of tenants, different types of tenants, it sounds to me, Peter, like there's no sort of two cases that are the same, really. So I'm sure anyone watching this is welcome to give you a call and sort of get some more bespoke information.
Absolutely, yeah. We act on behalf of both landlords and tenants. And as I said, we've had some really good results for landlords getting rent out to tenants by issuing proceedings or even threatening the issue of proceedings. But by the same token, we've had some good results for tenants in terms of negotiating with landlords and coming to a deal to defer rent payments or be a bit creative in terms of lease provisions so that they can carry on trading without the threat of proceedings going forward.
Thank you very much for your time, Peter. And if you'd like to contact Peter, you can do that via me, insideman@jmw.co.uk, or call 0161 82 81 999. I'm Dominic Walker, JMW's Inside Man.